Okay, that's fine. So the topic of tonight's talk is how medieval astrologers knew what you really wanted. But if you like detective mysteries, you might prefer my subtitle, which is The Curious Case of the Hidden's Back Head, an Astrological Mystery. This mysterious case exercised my mind for a good 2 years when I came across a number of curious techniques, and some of them seemed so bizarre I was left scratching my head for a long time, but all will be revealed later in this talk. And the research for my PhD involved looking at a 12th century manuscript written by a scholar called Roger of Hereford, who wrote the first astrology textbook in England, although he wrote it in Latin. Books didn't really have titles in those days, so manuscript librarians have come up with various unsatisfactory titles to catalogue his existing manuscripts. I've given it the snappier title of Judicial Astrology. It was designed as a teaching manual for horary astrology, and I have actually tried it out as a teaching manual when I delivered an online course on medieval astrology a couple of years ago, and it does actually work. And I'd like to mention in passing that this part of the country, which is the west of England and West Midlands, has really always punched above its weight when it comes to esoteric and astrological matters, and it still does. I mean, our group, Aquarius 7, was founded in 1981. It's one of the longest running astrology groups in the country, but this region's connection with astrology actually goes back nearly 1,000 years. Astrology was considered a dark art and very suspect in the Christian church in general, but in Hereford and Malvern and Bristol and Bath, astrology was promoted and encouraged by bishops and priors and even kings. Gerard, for example, who was the Bishop of Hereford, he was promoted to Archbishop of York in the year 1100, and he caused a scandal there because of his interest in astrology. And when he died peacefully in the garden in York a few years later, they found an astrology book. It was the Mathesis by Firmicus Maternus next to him, and it caused such a scandal that the monks of York refused to bury him in hallowed ground there. And yet his interest in astrology was seen as quite normal in Hereford, so there's always been something a little bit magical about this part of the country. So it was in this exciting new milieu and the rather risque atmosphere of Hereford that the hero of our story, Roger, who was already an innovative teacher at the cathedral school in Hereford, decided to collate all this newly translated astrological knowledge for the kids at his school. And in doing so, he wrote the first astrology textbook in England in the late 1170s. We don't know exactly when, probably about 1176. And here's the opening to the book. This picture is actually a 14th century copy of the 12th century. And it begins that since we discovered the rules of judicial astrology from diverse scattered works, we're going to combine it together in one combined supplement. So in other words, he's saying, I'm writing this is the first time this has all been put together. This is the first astrology textbook in England. So what were these mysterious new techniques that Roger was putting together? Well, it's important to state at the outset, they weren't new at all. After the Roman Emperor Justinian banished astrologers in the 6th century from the Roman Empire, a lot of these scholars went east to Persia and they studied there. And a century later, the mighty Persian Empire fell to the Muslim armies, but the new Islamic rulers embraced the teachings that they found and they translated a lot of these Greek and Persian texts into Arabic. So from the 8th century onwards, as astrology had become simplified and a lot of the techniques had got lost in the West, centers of learning in the Islamic world were wholeheartedly embracing them, and they were practicing astrology on a daily basis. And we saw a similar revolution in England in the 12th century, thanks to a plucky band of local astrologers encouraged by years of astrological interest by local bishops. So Wiltshire, who was the prior of Malvern, which is quite near Cheltenham, with the help of a Jewish convert to Christianity called Petrus Alfonsi, translated some of these newly discovered astronomical texts into Latin. And then a bit later on, a couple of decades later, Adelard of Bath learned Arabic himself. He travelled to Arabic centres of learning in Sicily and then Syria, and he taught astrology to the future King Henry II of England when Henry was a prince being brought up in Bristol. And Charles Burnet, who's a scholar of Arabic texts who's translated quite a lot of them into English, sees what he describes as a circle of West Midlands scholars operating along the Severn Valley, who visited all these Arabic centres of learning like Toledo in Spain. So Roger of Hereford had access to these newly translated texts, and they were new. So it's not that unreasonable that he was the first person to compile them into a textbook for the boys that he taught. And when I say boys, it really is quite likely he was teaching astrology not to adults, but to young teenagers. We know from a few decades later that undergraduates in the new universities like Oxford started at 14. So a lot earlier than undergraduates today, and boys in cathedral grammar schools are likely to have been that age or younger. So what I want to do now is run through the techniques in Roger's book, and some of these will be very familiar to you if you've ever done horary astrology, but others might come as a bit of a surprise. And in particular, he focuses strongly on finding out what he calls the intention of the person visiting the astrologer. And he's got a number of techniques to identify it that we're going to look at. But in case you don't know about horary astrology, I'll start off with a few of the basics. So the basics of horary astrology might be familiar to some of them, but it won't hurt to recap. So these next few slides are just summarising what Roger says at the start of his section on techniques. And they're not really radically different from the horary that was practiced by people like William Lilly 500 years later. His book starts off with some reference material, what's the zodiac, what do planet signs and houses mean, and so on. But the main meat of his book is what we're going to be looking at here. And he starts off with a simple rule. He doesn't give an actual example. And instead, what he does is he explains very succinctly a general rule for horary questions, which I think he does rather brilliantly. All the Arabic texts tend to give long lists of horary questions and how to answer them and go through them house by house. So if you were asking a question about a long journey, you'd trawl through a textbook by the 8th century Arabic author Salih ibn Bishr until you came across a heading called On Journeys, and that would tell you to look to the ruler of the ascendant and the moon to represent the person asking the question, and you'd look to the ruler of the 9th house to represent the outcome. It was more of a sort of reference book for people who already understood the basics of astrology. Roger was a teacher though, so he realised that all of these basically said, well, look at the ruler of the ascendant and the moon to represent the person asking the question. Then work out what house relates to the matter being asked about and use the ruler of that house for the matter. He fine-tunes it subsequently, but when you're teaching new students, and especially kids with short attention spans, you have to start off gently. So let's have a look at a contrived example. This one isn't in Roger's book, but it uses his principles. So here's a chart. He doesn't actually give the example, will I marry Jane, himself. This is my sample chart to illustrate his technique. So the questioner says, will I marry Jane? So the questioner is represented by the ruler of the ascendant. Now you can see the ascendant's in Pisces, and in medieval astrology, the ruler of the ascendant of Pisces is Jupiter. There was no Neptune in those days, remember? So the person, the questioner, or the querent, as it's called, is represented by Jupiter. The object of the querent's affections, anything, a question about love or partnerships, is going to be 7th house, and the ruler of the 7th house is Mercury. So the quesited, the matter in question, is represented by Mercury. So first of all, we notice that Mercury and Jupiter are both in pretty good nick. Jupiter's exalted in Cancer, aspects the ascendants, that's quite a nice Jupiter. Mercury is in rulership, very, very close to the sun. Normally that would be a bad thing, but it's so close to the sun that it's said to be cazimi if it's in within 17 minutes, and that's actually pretty good. Now, Mercury doesn't aspect Jupiter yet, but Mercury moves faster than Jupiter. So Mercury will fairly soon, unless he goes retrograde, reach 12 degrees of Virgo, at which point it'll be making a nice sextile to Jupiter. So Mercury is perfecting an aspect to Jupiter. So Mercury is rushing towards our querent. So it'll end happily ever after. Our querent is in love with Mercury. Mercury is rushing towards our querent. So that's a really good outcome. And that's a very simple example. And that's how Roger kind of starts off. He then gives some other examples, and again, not actual chart examples. I suspect this is because, as it was in a teaching environment, he was probably doing these examples on a wax tablet in the class rather than putting it in his textbook. And the other examples are used what we now call translation and collection. I like to use a non-astrological analogy here. Imagine that you want to communicate with some local worthy, like the local bishop. Well, clearly the easiest way of effecting this meeting is either you go to the bishop's residence or he comes to yours, and that's akin to the sort of perfecting aspects that we've just discussed. But let's say you can't travel very far because your horse is lame and the bishop's unwilling to come to you. Well, you can still communicate with the bishop by sending a friend who's going to represent you. He or she can go to the bishop's residence instead, and you might still get the outcome you're looking for. The simplest way is for your friend to come to your house first, get debriefed, and then head off to the bishop's residence and pass on the message. And the second method is, let's say your friend lives halfway between you and the bishop, so neither you nor the bishop are willing to travel to each other's residences because that's too far, but you're both willing to travel to your friend's residence and meet up there. So the first method, a friend coming to you and then on to somebody else, is akin to translation, and the second is akin to collection. So here's another example. I've got a question here where a mother asks the astrologer, will I see my estranged son? So she's the querent, and it's Aries rising, so she's represented by Mars. Her son is represented by the fifth house, her child, and that's the cusp of the fifth house is Leo, so the sun is her son. And the sun is separating from Mars, so it looks like the sun is running away from the mother, and because the sun moves faster than Mars, and she's never going to see him again. But look at Mercury. Mercury is at 10 degrees Aries, and provided he doesn't go retrograde, he's going to catch up with Mars fairly soon, and then he'll race ahead and catch up with the sun. So Mercury can pass this message from Mars to the sun, and yes, she will be able to get in touch with her son again. And the second example I want to give is the one that's equivalent to collection. This time a woman asks, will I marry this man? She's represented by the Lord of the Ascendant, which is Mars again. So she's Mars in Libra. And the man is the ruler of the seventh house, which is Venus. Now there's no aspect between Mars and Venus. You might think there's a quincunx, but they didn't have quincunxes. In medieval astrologies, it was strictly conjunctions, sextiles, squares, trines, and oppositions. However, Venus will perfect an aspect with the slow-moving Jupiter fairly soon. She's at 16 degrees, and Venus will soon reach 22 degrees, and that's perfecting an aspect with Jupiter. And similarly, Mars at 12 degrees is also heading towards a square with Jupiter. It's a difficult aspect, but it is an aspect. So the two do eventually come together by bumping into each other in Jupiter's hangout. So that's a couple of basic techniques. And the next slide is a photograph that I took at Graham's housewarming party a few years ago. And it's a technique called reception. Now, when you go to a party at Buckingham Palace, you walk into the palace where you're received by the Queen. An astrological reception works a bit like this. A planet receives another planet into his or her home. So let's have a look at some examples of reception. So in this example, Venus is in Cancer and the moon is in Pisces. So neither of them are in rulership, neither of them are exalted where they are, but the moon rules Cancer. Now, I learnt my medieval art at Bernadette Brady's knee on her Astrologers course, so I'm going to use Bernadette's analogy here. The moon rules Cancer. She might be in a different sign. She's in Pisces, but Cancer is her favourite coffee shop. It's the coffee shop that she owns. So she likes anybody that hangs out in her coffee shop. So she likes Venus because Venus is hanging out in Cancer. That means she receives Venus warmly, and any nice attributes the moon might have will be shared with Venus. So that's an example of reception. Now here's another example that looks very similar. The moon is, Venus is still in Cancer, and the moon would still like anybody that hangs out in Cancer. So she should like Venus, but the trouble is, because the moon's in Gemini and doesn't aspect Venus, she can't see her coffee shop, so she can't help anybody in it. She doesn't know that Venus is there. So the moon doesn't receive Venus. The word aspect, we're used to thinking of it in modern terms as an angle between two planets, but anything with the word spect in is to do with viewing. Think about spectacles or spectator sports. And that's what aspect means. Aspect means you can see something. And medieval aspects, as I say, were limited to conjunctions, sextiles, squares, trines, and oppositions. So there's no semi-sextile. There's no way that the moon can see Venus. Venus is hidden from her, so there can't be any reception. Now, the next example is, here we've got Saturn. Saturn's in detriment in Leo. He's the greater malefic in medieval astrology. He's the bad guy. I mean, he doesn't get a good rap these days in modern astrology either. And this time he's in Leo. He's in detriment, so he's in a particularly bad mood. But here's the sun in Aries, and of course the sun likes anybody that hangs out in Leo, and there's Saturn. And the sun does aspect Saturn. It's a trine. So the sun can see him, so that means that Saturn might be a grumpy old man, but he's a grumpy old man with his feet up being served tea and scones by the sun, so he's not quite as grumpy as he might be. The sun has received him, he's looking after him, and Saturn gets some of the sun's nice qualities. And most of the Arabic texts all say that actually a malefic is the bad effects are ameliorated. They're not quite as bad if there's some nice reception going on. Now, of course, it's entirely possible for two planets to be in each other's signs, which is a mutual reception. And we still use mutual receptions in modern astrology. So here's an example. Mercury is in Aries, Mars is in Gemini. Well, Mercury is in Mars's sign and Mars is in Mercury's sign. So it's a mutual reception. But in medieval astrology, it's only a mutual reception if there's an aspect. So if you had, for example, the Sun in Cancer and the Moon in Leo, in modern astrology, we'd say that was a mutual reception. In medieval astrology, it wouldn't be because they're not aspecting each other. And finally, I want to give you an example of reception that isn't very useful. Here, the Moon is in Scorpio, so she likes anybody that hangs out in Cancer, and Mars is there. Mars rules Scorpio in medieval astrology, so likes the Moon. So there is a mutual reception going on here, but the Moon is in poor shape in Scorpio. She's in fall. So she still receives Mars, but she's weak. Mars doesn't like being in Cancer either. He's in fall as well, so he's also in a weak state. So he still likes anyone that hangs out in Scorpio, so he receives the Moon. But what use is that? Mars is being received by a very weak Moon who isn't in much of a position to help, and the Moon is being received by a weak Mars who can't help either. Now, the horary astrologer John Frawley likens this to two drunks propping each other up trying to get home. They might be trying to help each other, but they'll probably fall over on the way anyway. So let's actually take a look at a practical example. And this is also a really useful lesson in determining the accuracy of medieval charts, by the way. There weren't any accurate clocks in medieval times, so birth times are really suspect. And in some cases, the elevation of the sun was measured using an astrolabe. It only works if it's a sunny day, of course, or the elevation of certain stars at night. And actually, that's much more accurate than most medieval clocks. Now, this particular horoscope is rather controversial for reasons that I haven't got time to go into here. But the author of this horoscope, John Holbrook, apparently claimed that he had been the very first man to view the new baby with his own eyes. Now, this is the chart for Henry VI, born in 1421. But look when he was born in 1421. The 5th day of December, in the afternoon, at 3 hours and 20 minutes and 56 seconds. Now, I'm not sure if anybody here knows their birth time to the nearest second. I certainly don't. I've never met anybody that knows their birth time to the nearest second. So, and they certainly wouldn't have had clocks in medieval times that were accurate even to within minutes, let alone seconds. So how does he come up with this? And actually, there's a technique described by Ptolemy in the Tetrabiblos called the animudar, which is from a Persian word namudar, meaning diagram. And that's used to rectify the degree of the ascendant or midheaven. And in fact, I've gone through this fairly carefully, and you can see that the technique really does yield an answer of 3 hours, 20 minutes and 56 seconds. John Holbrook would have known that the baby was born in the afternoon. He got there, met Henry's wife, who just had the baby, and it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. In fact, the Annals of Bermondsey that recorded the birth simply claimed it was in the 4th hour after lunch. And of course, we don't actually know when lunch was. So the baby was probably born at about 4 o'clock. And then John Holbrook rectified this to give this highly accurate time, drew up a chart. You can see it's a square chart that he's drawn up here. And look at the detail that he goes into. That's kind of an analysis of it. The thing I find a little bit weird is it does say this is the horoscope for Henry VI. But he couldn't possibly have drawn it up on the day that Henry VI was born because he wasn't called Henry VI then. Henry V was on the throne. So that's why this is a little bit strange. He did come to his father did die when he was very, very young, but it's still a little bit weird that Henry VI, it would have been written as Henry VI, even though the baby didn't come to the throne until he was 9 months old. So let's take a very quick look at this chart. I've drawn it up in modern terms. It's much easier for us to read it here. So this is a more modern illustration of it. Now, there's a lot of strong planets. You've got the Moon is in Taurus, so that's exalted. You've got Mars in Scorpio in rulership. the sun in fire signs is quite nice. Jupiter in fire signs is quite nice as well in medieval astrology. But Mars, you might think Mars in Scorpio, Mars in rulership, we've got a warrior king here. This is a really good chart. But no, he suffered from depression. He wasn't interested in wars at all. He lost the land his father, Henry V, again to Agincourt, but he was a great patron of learning. So what reception can we see here? Well, you'll see that, that Saturn receives Venus and vice versa. Venus is in Capricorn, which is Saturn's sign. Saturn is in Libra. They trine each other, so they're aspecting each other. So we have a Saturn-Venus mutual reception. And we also have a Sun-Jupiter mutual reception. Jupiter's in Leo, the Sun's in Sagittarius. So we've got two mutual receptions going on here, which really do seem to be like themes. Saturn and Venus and Jupiter Sun are both key themes because he was married to Margaret of Anjou, and his marriage seems to have been one of consolidating power. It lasted for a long time. Margaret clearly supported him through all his spells of depression, and I think that depression might be shown by Mercury being in detriment there. And she was a very strong woman in her own right. Jupiter Sun is particularly interesting. And Mars, although Mars is in rulership, and you might think that's the warrior king, Mars doesn't aspect any other planets. Mars is, can't really be a warrior king because Mars is a warrior without an army. So it's not able to work. And also he's in the 6th house, which is a bit of a weak house. So he's not a warrior king at all. And Henry wasn't interested in military matters. He wasn't very martial. Instead, he was very devout, and he founded universities and colleges. And I think that sounds an awful lot more like Jupiter than it does of Mars. So we can see that Sun-Jupiter theme coming through here, and that Saturn-Venus one. Strong marriage, not necessarily happy, but all about consolidating power. Sun-Jupiter, all about being devout, founding universities and colleges. And he was even revered as a saint after he died by some people. I mean, he was probably murdered. So we can see that reception adds quite a big flavour to this, and that is quite important in medieval astrology, and Roger dwells on this quite a lot in his textbook. And after getting this out of the way, Roger, he doesn't give this particular example, but he gives lots of examples and rules for reception. I'm having to create examples based on Roger's text. And after he's got this main horary technique under his belt, he moves on to the second part of the book on intentions, which we will discuss after 8 o'clock. But just to summarise what he said so far, he's teaching a bunch of school kids in a grammar school, and he's teaching them astrology, and he kicks off by giving them all the basic techniques. He takes simple rules, and then he builds up. He gives example after example, but what happens if these planets aren't in good condition? You can't use them. Well, in that case, you use something else. And he keeps building rule after rule after rule. And it really does work very much like a textbook. And you can see how he's starting off simple, just as a modern teacher would do. And he's building layer upon layer upon layer on it. And it just seems to be a brilliant way of teaching children. I did actually run this course for the Sophia Centre alumni, and I used a lot of his examples and techniques to see if they would work for a modern audience, and they really do. His techniques do come over as being quite modern. The other thing that I just want to finish this section on before we get to 7:50 is he starts off his book with a prologue, and you might think that the church is a little bit iffy about astrology and he'd have to be a bit apologetic about teaching it and have to put a real Christian angle on it. But no, he says, why is astrology the best art of all? And he gives various reasons, and he says, but the main one is it lets you see into the future, and that gives you power over other people. It gives man power over man. And telling a bunch of kids that they ought to learn astrology because it's going to give them power over other people sounds like quite an extraordinary thing for a cathedral school teacher to be telling his students. So we'll carry on in 8:05, and I'll show you some of these intentions techniques. But let's take a break now and go and show our appreciation for the key workers in the NHS.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Okay, see you in 5 minutes.
Okay.
So it's just 8:04 now, isn't it, Chris?
Yes, yeah.
Oh,
Nick Campion was saying in his street, they got a lot of musicians, so they all agree what they're going to play at 8 o'clock on Thursday, go out onto the street and play it, which I think is
wonderful. Okay, Chris, shall we resume?
Yep, absolutely. Right, so as I said just before the break, after getting the main horary techniques under our belt, Roger now tells us that this is the start of his second book on intentions. And he tells us that we need to consider the querent's intentions and that there are various ways of doing this. But what's the point? Surely if somebody comes to see you, the astrologer, they already know why they're coming to see you. So how does it help to know the intention? Well, consider this example. Let's say that a client comes to see you and says, will my father recover from his illness? It's a straightforward horary question. The father is 4th house and the illness is the 6th house, but it's the father's illness. So it's the 6th house from the 4th. This is a fairly common horary technique where you turn the houses. So you say, if it was me asking the question, my illness would be the 6th house, but I'm asking about my father. The father is the 4th house. Note the 4th house, not the 10th house, as it might be in among some modern astrologers. And the 6th house from the 4th is the 9th house. So we just use our usual techniques to look at the ruler of the 4th and the ruler of the 9th. So that's all pretty simple, isn't it? But the client is telling you that this is his question. But suppose that's not really his question. Suppose his question really is he wants to know when he's going to get his hand on dad's pile of cash. When am I going to get my inheritance is what his real question is. That's his intention, but he's not going to admit that to you. So Roger says you need to know what's going on behind the scenes. And this is what his book on intentions is all about. So it's suddenly become an 8th house question. 8th house isn't just death, it's other people's money as well, it's inheritances. Now, modern astrologers sometimes draw up a consultation chart, which is quite similar, to get an idea of how the reading will be understood by their client. And that's similar. But the thing is, the consultation chart and a natal chart for a modern astrologer is going to be very different. But when you're doing horary, the consultation chart and the horary chart are probably going to be identical. There wasn't any email back then, so you don't know the question until the client arrives. So we can't use the same techniques for both. So that's why Roger gives us different techniques. So he gives us two techniques to start with for the intention. One, he refers to them as duodenaria and novenes. Now, duodenaria, or 12 parts, is a way of dividing up a sign into 12 segments of 2.5 degrees. It's actually a Hellenistic technique called dodecatomoria. And in this slide, we can see that Aries is divided into 12 segments. The first 2.5 degrees is ruled by Aries, the second Taurus, and so on. And then for Taurus, the first duodenarium is ruled by Taurus, the second by Gemini, and so on. So it's a kind of mini zodiac within there. And we'll see how these are used in a minute. And there's a similar system found in Indian astrology, which involves dividing a sign into 9 parts of 3 degrees, 20 minutes each, called novenes. In Indian astrology, they're known as Navbarat. And novenes begin with Aries. The first novene of Aries is Aries, and the next novene is Taurus, and so on. Now, of course, you can't cram a whole mini zodiac of novenes into a sign because you can only fit 9 of them in. So we only get 9 into Aries. So when you get to Taurus, you just carry on where you left off. So the first novene of Taurus is Capricorn, ruled by Saturn, as you can see in this example here. So how do we use them? Well, Roger gives an example here. Now, it's only a general example, so I'm going to give a specific case to illustrate his example. In his example, he says, look at the nature of the rising sign, note the rising degree and the duodenaria that contains the ascending degree. Look for the house that is occupied by that sign and then its lord to find the intention. So let's say that we cast a chart and the ascendant is 11 degrees of Scorpio. Well, what we do is we say, well, what's the duodenarium of 11 degrees of Scorpio? Well, Scorpio, all signs begin with their own sign for the first 2.5 degrees. So the first 2.5 degrees is Scorpio, then Sag, then Capricorn, then Aquarius, then Pisces. So we can see this red line here shows us that 11 degrees of Scorpio is in the duodenarium of Pisces. So let's say that here's our chart. The rising degree is 11 Scorpio and the duodenarium is Pisces. Well, which house has its cusp in Pisces? And the answer is the 5th house. The lord of Pisces, the ruler of Pisces, is Jupiter, and Jupiter in this example is in the 4th house. So Roger gives us this an example very similar to this. What happens if the duodenarium's in the 5th house and its lord's in the 4th? It's about the inheritance of sons. So in fact, if that was the chart for this particular question, when the chap's asking about his father's illness, we might be able to see that that was his real intention. Now, we can consider the rule another method. He gives lots and lots and lots of methods for intentions. Another method he gives is consider the lord of the ascendant. Well, of course, we consider the ruler of the ascendant anyway to represent the querent, but it can also be used to dig a little bit deeper. So he gives an example. If the lord of the ascendant were to fall in the 11th and joined with something in the 7th, it concerns the love of women. So here's an example. The lord of the ascendant in this case is the moon in the 11th house. She's joined to Mars by trine in the 7th house. So it concerns the love, that 7th house, of women, the moon. Now that's pretty simplistic astrology, just using keywords, and it's all a bit general. But he gets an awful lot more detailed than that. So here's another example where if a planet were in the 5th house and the 5th house's lord is Saturn, and Saturn's in the 6th house in Taurus, in which sign Saturn signifies the stomach, one would consider the sickness of the stomach of the sun. So that example's a lot more detailed. Let's break it down a little bit and see what on earth he's talking about. In this example, the lord of the ascendant, in this case the ascendant is Scorpio, so the ruler of the ascendant is Mars, is in the 5th house. And the lord of the 5th house, you can see that the 5th house cusp there is Aquarius, so the lord of the 5th house is Saturn, and Saturn is in the 6th house in Taurus. So 6th house is illness, 5th house is sun, so we can see that it's to do with an illness of the suns. But also each sign rules a part of the body. You're probably familiar with the kind of the zodiac man, where Aries is the head and you work down, Taurus is the throat, all the way down to Pisces being the feet. But in addition, Roger gives us a list of ailments, which were first written about by the Arabic author Al-Khabisi, where each planet in a sign means something, and in Alcibiades' method, Saturn in Taurus represents the stomach. Now, incidentally, this is proof that Roger wasn't using real charts. He wasn't using client charts. He made up examples from the top of his head. There's actually a bit of a problem with the ruler of the fifth house being Saturn, but Saturn being in Taurus, and it's to do with the geographical location where such a chart is possible. Have a think about why. I haven't got time to go for it in this talk, but there's a handout that I'm going to make available at the end of the talk, and the explanation for it is there. Let's just say it was actually very difficult to find a chart that fitted his example. He then goes on to say you can use the part of fortune to determine intentions as well. So the part of fortune, look at its sign and house. If it's in the first, it concerns things in the first house and so on. But of course, Roger's students must be getting a bit overwhelmed about this. They're told, well, you can use the duodenaria for intention, or you can use novenes, or you can use something called trigenia, which I haven't mentioned at all, and Roger only mentions in one sentence in passing, or the Lord of the Ascendant, or the part of fortune, or various other methods that we'll come to in a minute. So you're learning astrology and you'll suddenly have all these techniques thrown at you. And what he says is, well, look, lots of things can arise. There are lots of different modes, and you need all of these methods to narrow things down a bit. When you're using several methods, which ones conflict and which ones support each other? If you get lots of votes for the intention relating to inheritances, for instance, but only one for travel or sickness, you've probably hit the nail on the head with inheritances. And actually, the different techniques that he's got, it possibly confused Roger as well, why there were so many, they actually represent different opinions from Arabic sources, which themselves came from older sources. So the Arabic author Omer of Tiberias tells us that the part of fortune is attributed to Dorotheus, who was a Hellenistic author. The ruler of the Ascendant method, well, that's attributed to Hermes, another generic Hellenistic text. Duodenaria and novenes associated with the Indians. In fact, that's not true. Duodenaria Hellenistic, novenes are the Indian technique. And then he says that Masha'Allah, who was an early Arabic astrologer, used a complicated formula that took all of them into account, and the one with the most testament is one. And that seems to be what Roger's getting at here. Try them all out and see which ones agree with each other. So, for example, if we just look at the part of fortune in this house, it's in the 9th house in Sagittarius. And the ruler of the 9th house in this example is Jupiter, also in Sagittarius. So the intention has a Jupiter and a 9th house flavour to it. But what does that actually mean? Is the intention involved with religion or travel or dreams? Because they're all 9th house issues. How do you narrow it down? And here, Roger gives us yet another method for determining intention. This is really quite a curious technique. I hadn't come across it when I first saw it. And he frequently refers to significators having to be in good condition. And the technique he describes, he's now described, he also relies on this. Provided the Lord of the Ascendant is in good nick, look at the house it's in, and then you divide that house into a number of equal segments. Now, it's not regular, and how many segments depends on the house. There doesn't seem to be any inherent logic behind this system. So the first and second houses aren't divided. The third house is to do with local movement and brothers and sisters. The 6th house is always illness and servants. So he's divided the first house as patients and their illness, second as slave servants and beasts. But the 5th house, for example, is divided into 4. And that's given sons, well, yep, children as a 5th house thing, but then clothes, letters and tidings for the 3rd quarter, and writings and books for the 4th. None of those are really considered 5th house issues. So why this division? We really don't know. It's just something he's picked up from an Arabic source and is using, and they don't always seem to be terribly logical. So that's the breakdown of them. And they're all listed in the handout, all 12 houses here. So let's have a look at an example. In this case, the Lord of the Ascendant, we've got Pisces rising. The Lord of the Ascendant is Jupiter. Jupiter's in Sagittarius at 22 degrees Sag, so he's in good condition in rulership, quite close to the MC. That's a pretty strong Jupiter in the 9th house. Now, the 9th house is divided into 4 segments. And in this case, the 9th house begins at 1 degree Sag and ends at 29 Sag. So it's 28 degrees in scope. So if we divide that into 4, they're 4 7-degree segments. Jupiter's just over 22, so it's just about in the 4th segment. Now, the ninth house means several things, and Roger's text tells us what. He says that the first quarter of the ninth house is faith, the second is journeys, the third is wisdom, and the fourth is dreams. So in this case, the intention relates to a dream that the questioner had. Perhaps the dream is the reason that the client came to see the astrologer. Might have had a disturbing dream and has therefore come to see the astrologer with a question. Now, I haven't seen this technique in any Arabic sources, but it is described almost identically in a text by Abraham ibn Ezra. And it was being partially translated by Ben Dykes. And I asked Ben if he knew the provenance of it, since Ibn Ezra usually drew on earlier sources, but he'd only come across the Ibn Ezra text. But I've subsequently discovered that a text called Eudikia, Judgments, which the Arabs ascribed to Ptolemy, although it wasn't actually Ptolemy, has an almost identical technique. Another technique for determining intentions is from the Lord of the Hour, which brings us to some more techniques that are rarely seen today in horary. And again, I thought this was a bizarre and rather new technique. In most of the previous examples, Roger tells us that you can only use a particular technique if the Lord of the Ascendant or the Moon are in good condition. Now, this technique is one that you can use when that isn't the case. Instead, what we do here is make use of the Lord of the Hour. So let's start by seeing what that means. Well, planetary days are fairly obvious, especially if you speak pretty much any Mediterranean language. In England and Germany, most of our days are named after Norse gods, but in France, Spain and Italy, they're mainly named after planets. Even in England, we have Sunday, Moon Day and Saturn Day, and the Latin names for days make it really obvious which planet they're related to. So Friday is Dies Veneris, the day of Venus. Thursday is Dies Iovis, the day of Jupiter. Dies Mercurii for Wednesday, day of Mercury. So planetary days are pretty obvious just from the day names, if you're a Latin speaker, which Roger was. His text was written in Latin. But to understand planetary hours, we have to realise that medieval timekeeping wasn't the same as modern timekeeping. We have 24 hours in a day of 60 minutes each. Now, in medieval times, the usual way of dividing the day was into day and night. Day started at sunrise and it ended at sunset, and night started at sunset and finished at sunrise. So the day and night could be of different lengths. In fact, they were always of different lengths, except at the equinoxes. The day was divided into 12 equal hours, and the night was divided into 12 equal hours. So at the equinox, the sun rises at 600 and sets at 1800. The day and the night are both the same length, so dividing either into 12 gives us 12 equinoctial hours of 60 minutes each. That's what we mean by an hour today in modern times. But at other times of the year, this isn't the case. So let's take the extreme example at the winter solstice. In the UK, the sun rises at about 0800 and it sets at about 1600. So the day is only 8 hours long and the night is 16 hours. So when you divide the day into 12 diurnal daytime hours, that makes each diurnal hour 40 minutes. And dividing the long night into 12 nocturnal hours makes each nocturnal hour 80 minutes. So now we know that, let's see how planetary hours work. The first diurnal hour of every day starts with the planet for that day. So in other words, at sunrise on Thursday, it's Thursday today, so it's Jupiter's day today. So the first hour of the day was ruled by Jupiter. The next was ruled by Mars, then the Sun, and so on, in what we call the Chaldean order. The Chaldean order is just the order of planets in order of speed. Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon. Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, etc. So as we can see from the diagram, the 12th diurnal hour following that sequence is Mercury. And then the next one is going to be the Moon. And that's the first nocturnal hour. And we keep going on until the 12th nocturnal hour is the Sun. And then that's followed by the first hour of tomorrow will be Venus, which is a good job because Friday is indeed Venus's day. So that's how planetary hours work. If you've got solar fire, it will tell you what the planetary hour is for a chart. So let's have a look at an example. I was actually going to use tonight's chart for this talk, but the trouble is the Lord of the Ascendant and the Moon are in quite good condition. So I had to find a chart that fitted Roger's requirements that both of them should be impeded or in bad condition. So here's a chart for Saturday the 13th of October 2007 at 08:54 BST in London. Sun rose at 7:26 BST and it set at 18:07. So the length of the day was 641 minutes and the length of the diurnal hour is 53 minutes and 25 seconds. So since the sun rose at 7:26 and each diurnal hour is just over 53 minutes, it was the hour of Saturn at sunrise, because it's Saturday, followed by the hour of Jupiter 53 minutes later. And then 53 minutes after that, it was the hour of Mars. So at our chart, 8:54 was in the hour of Jupiter. Now here, in this example, the Lord of the Ascendant, the ruler of the Ascendant is Mars, and Mars is in fallen Cancer. So we can't use it's impeded to use Roger's terminology. We can't use it. The moon's also in fall, so we can't use that. So now we see if the Lord of the Hour is unencumbered. We just saw that the Lord of the Hour was Jupiter, and Jupiter is indeed in quite good condition in Sagittarius. It's in rulership, it trines the MC, so that's not bad. So now for the curious bit. What we do is we see how many degrees has risen in its sign, multiply it by 12 and project that onto the ascendant. And wherever that ends up tells us about the intention. So how many degrees into Sagittarius is Jupiter? Well, it's 16 degrees in, or 16 degrees and 10 minutes. Multiply that by 12 and that gives you 194 degrees. So starting from the ascendant, we move around 194 degrees and we end up here in the middle of Taurus, 19 of Taurus, in fact, in the 7th house. So this is going to be a 7th house intention. Another modern way of thinking about what this actually means is like this. Jupiter's just over halfway through Sagittarius. It's 53.8% of the way through Sagittarius, if you want to be precise. So starting from the ascendant, what is 53.8% of the entire circle? Well, 194 degrees. Now, this bizarre technique doesn't appear in most Arabic sources, but Masha Allah does use something similar, not for intention, but for finding a lost object. So in this case, then, the querent's intention is going to be 7th house stuff with a Taurus flavour. And Taurus is ruled by Venus, and Venus is in Virgo, in fall, and conjunct the South Node and Saturn. So it's probably something very unsavoury, murdering his business partner, perhaps, or a furtive visit to Miss Whiplash's house of pain, or something like that. So you can get an idea of the intention by using that technique if the ascendant and the moon are in bad condition. And finally, we come on to the curious case of the hidden bat's head. We're still using the Lord of the Hour here, and he has this long rambling section where each planetary hour is divided into 3, and each third is associated with both an intention and a hidden object. Now, the intention bit made sense to me when I read this, but I puzzled for ages over the hidden object bit. So the querent turns up at 2:30. It's the last part of the planetary hour of the sun, say. So when you read Roger's text here, it says the hour is divided into 3. So if the stolen or missing thing is in the first part of the hour of the sun, it's going to be yourself that's lost it, or one of your associates has stolen it. But then he says the hidden thing will be food or herbs. In the second, look for advice concerning war or siege. The hidden thing will be bones or land. And it's in the last third, look for advice or debate. The hidden thing will be white wool or thread or something twisting. It's like, well, what on earth does that mean? Well, Ben Dykes once again came to my rescue when I collared him at the AA conference a few years ago. And the hidden thing is a sort of tester. He said that Lily used it too. I wasn't aware of that. If you visit an astrologer to ask whether you'll get the job you applied for, if the astrologer starts off by telling you that you've got a mole on your left buttock, these days you might sort of assume that the astrologer had seen some sort of revenge porn involving you. But before the days of the internet, it would simply have demonstrated that you were an excellent astrologer, able to know things about you that nobody else could possibly know, because you are, after all, a kind of magician. I'm an astrologer and I know what lucky charm you're carrying, something made of white wool, for example. So I'm obviously an astrologer of immense skill. That's the idea behind this technique. So let's have a look at a practical real life example. Well, okay, I lied about the real life bit. The querent visits the astrologer on Tuesday, the 6th of August, 1185 at noon in Hereford, as measured by the astrologer's highly accurate sundial or astrolabe. And the querent has secreted about his person a lucky charm, of which the astrologer is unaware because it's concealed. Or is he? Well, first of all, we calculate the planetary hour. The day is 14 hours and 38 minutes long, so each diurnal hour is 73 minutes and 10 seconds. Noon is 7 hours and 16 minutes after sunrise. The day is Tuesday, it's the Julian calendar back then, remember. So the first planetary hour is Mars. And if we just go down all of these, we can see that the hour of Saturn runs from 10:49 and 50 seconds to 12:03. So noon means that we're in the hour of Saturn, and we're in the final third of the hour of Saturn. So what does that tell us? Well, we consult our manuscript to see what the hidden objects are for the hour of Saturn. And this almost magical information tells us that if it's in the first part of the hour of Saturn, you look for education, bearing books and so on. The hidden thing is glassy or green. It's in the second. It's a fighting man or a woman who would give birth. And if it's in the day, it'll be masculine and so on. The hidden thing is iron. If it's in the last, it concerns his illness or friend's illness or war or discord or grief. So that's fine. But what about the hidden object? And the hidden thing is the head of a bat or a bird of two colours. So armed with this information, the astrologer can now freak the client out by telling him that the client's lucky charm is a two-coloured bird, maybe a feather from a two-coloured bird, or a bat's head. So it might be some sort of lucky charm that the client has got hidden in his pocket. So the case is solved. So I hope that's given you a taster of a few things that you can play with. Medieval and modern astrology aren't divided by a Berlin Wall anymore, at least not in the UK. You can use some of these long-lost medieval techniques in your modern practice, and you can still use quincunxes to Neptune on top of all that if you want to. So far from being dry, dusty and dead, I hope I've persuaded you that medieval astrology, and in particular finding out what your client really, really wants, can be fun for all the family. So thank you very much indeed. But before I stop sharing my screen, I just want to say that everything I've covered in this evening is in a PDF handout, which you can download at the URL shown here, tinyurl.com/Roger Hereford. The handout digs a little bit deeper as well. Roger does provide a worked example in his text, which we didn't have time to cover tonight, but it is covered in the handout. And you're also very welcome to email me if you've got any questions. That's also on the handout. And I'll put this in the chat box too in a minute, so you can just copy it, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions. So thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Chris. That was really amazing. Yes, let's give Chris a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. It's amazing how intricate and how detailed and how very different medieval astrology is, and how kind of practical it was, and practical in the way it was used. So it's really fascinating to hear. It's also quite kind of gratifying in a way that the first astrologers in the United Kingdom were quite close to here. That's quite good to hear, that they're in the Vale of Seven and we're Aquarius 7, so that's good.
Exactly. You see, our region has been touched by astrology for nearly a millennium.
Wow, that's good to know. Fascinating techniques, and be really interesting to try them out when next doing a horary chart. Thank you again, Chris.
Absolutely.
So we've got some comments. I'm not sure I've got a question from Wendy Fay. So Wendy is asking, what house system did Roger use?
He used Alcabitius, which is actually named after Al-Kabisi, who was an Arabic astrologer of the 9th century, I think. There was some suggestion in his work's example that he might have used whole sign, but certainly one of the examples that I've seen drawn up in a later manuscript has house cusps that are definitely Alcabitius. Now, whether that was the 14th century astrologer drawing the house cusps on, or whether that was Roger's original, we don't know, but it does look as though he was using Alcabitius.
Chris, did you say where he was buried? Is he buried in Hereford?
That's a really interesting question. Nobody knows. He's a bit of a mystery man, is Roger. A source from the 1930s that did a biography on him claimed that he ended his days as a monk in Bury St Edmunds. But there's no evidence for that, and that I've seen subsequently, and that's kind of been discredited. But I received an email just as I was finishing my PhD from an American professor who claimed to be the 23rd great-grandson of Roger of Hereford. And I was a bit barking mad, but he sent me Burke's Landed Gentry, which did indeed say the Hereford family of, who live in Mordyford near Hereford at the moment, claim descent from the famous philosopher Roger of Hereford. So Burke's Landed Gentry do give a family tree all the way down to this 1890 copy of Burke's Gentry. I then logged on to Ancestry Co UK and did a bit more digging, and we got right down to somebody, an actor who appeared in The Girl with Dragon Tattoo, Mark Hereford, who lives in Los Angeles now, but he was born in Hereford, in Mordyford, and his brother is the inheritor of the estate, and they still claim that the family have been there since Norman times, and that they are indeed the descendants of Roger of Hereford. And because it's a stately home, it's open to the public twice a year. So I was hoping to go this year, but it's not looking very likely at the moment, but maybe next year, and actually have a look round. And obviously, he wouldn't have been a monk in Bury St Edmunds if he had had children and boasted about it. If he'd had children as a monk, he would have kept very quiet about it. So who knows? Maybe his descendants are still alive and well and living in Hereford.
I sense an Aquarius 7 field trip to Hereford coming on, Chris.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so are there any more questions for Chris? Gillian Crawford says, if you want to draw up a chart for a really old event or birth, how do you adjust for the Gregorian or Julian calendar?
Solar Fire and most software will do it for you, but it's a bit hit and miss because countries changed at different times. The Gregorian calendar came in the 1500s, I can't remember the exact date, in most of Europe, but Britain, even back then, I'm afraid, was rather Eurosceptic and didn't want to do what those Catholics did, so they refused to change. We refused to change until 1752? When we eventually did decide to change the calendar. And the lovely little sideline from that is nobody really minded losing 11 days, despite all the rumours to the contrary that you might hear, except for the traders who didn't like the idea of paying their taxes early. And in those days, you had to pay your tax on the 25th of March, which was Ladies' Day. That was 9 months before Christmas. And all the traders said, we're not paying our tax early. So the Inland Revenue went, oh, all right, then you can pay it 11 days late and we'll set the tax date to the 5th of April instead of the 25th of March. And that's why our tax year finishes bizarrely on the 5th of April, is all because of those traders back in the 1750s that didn't want to pay their taxes.
Chris Lee is saying that it was 1752 as well.
Right,
yep.
Right. Phew.
Okay. Richard is asking if there's a translation of the book available.
No, but my thesis is available online, and it's kind of a paraphrase rather than a translation. I'd love to work on a translation of it, but my Latin isn't good enough to do a critical translations. But my thesis does have is a kind of translation. It's a paraphrasing of it, and that's freely available online. I'll just post the link to that in the chat box in a sec. Just need to find it. Oops. Search. Right, there we go. Unfortunately, I don't think you can, if I'll type it in the chat box, but for some bizarre reason, I don't think you can actually, I don't think you can actually click on links, and I don't know why. It seems a little bit bizarre. So I'll copy that and paste it there.
Great.
If you can cut and paste that, that just takes you to a PDF of my thesis, and that goes into a lot of detail, and it gives all the stuff that I've been talking about tonight and quite a lot more as well.
Great, thank you, Chris. Chris Lee says astrologer John Dee tried to persuade Queen Elizabeth with his own adjustment to the system that would be named after him, but it was rejected by the church as being too popish.
I always find it really bizarre because you kind of tend to think that maybe Protestants are going to be much more anti-astrology than Catholics. But of course, the Catechism of the Catholic Church today condemns astrology. It's very explicit. That was the one written in 1982 by Pope John Paul II. Mm-hmm. And the person that's responsible for introducing the astrolabe into Europe appears to have been Gerbert d'Aurillac, who became Pope Sylvester II in the year 999. So we have a pope to thank for introducing astrology into Christian Europe again in the West. And of course, during the time of Lilly, Lilly became a parliamentarian and was a practicing astrologer, and yet other people like Gadbury and so on were Catholics, and they were all working together. And the thing that astonished me was I assumed that Lilly was always a Puritan, but apparently he got really annoyed because somebody, Sir George Wharton, wrote a very nasty critique of him. And Lilly writes in his diary, up until that point, I was more royalist than Roundhead, but I was so annoyed about it, I devoted my course to Parliament after that. So he suddenly changed sides because he got really annoyed because somebody gave him a bad review, which I thought was extraordinary.
Well, fickle of him. Because William Lilly was one of the greatest English astrologers, wasn't he, Chris?
That's why I always like to tease people and say that Roger of Hereford wrote the first English astrology book, because everybody thinks it was Lilly that wrote it.
Chris, may I ask, did this idea about looking into the questions behind the question, did that carry on after Roger of Hereford?
I don't know.
Did other people use those techniques?
We know that the idea goes back to the 3rd century, I think, with the Indians, and certainly early Arabic authors like Saul write about it in passing. Roger seems to be the first one I found that actually makes a really clear point that this is about finding intentions rather than mentioning it in passing. And Ben Dyke says that William Lilly used these testers, but whether he used that technique or not, I don't know. I need to read a bit more Lilly and find out that. So I don't know if he was using any of those techniques for intentions, or if he had a different method for finding the fact that you had a mole on your left buttock or whatever, all the things that Lilly used to do. So I don't know. It's a very interesting question.
And another question that occurs to me is horary is a fascinating branch of astrology. Was it popular for centuries in
Absolutely
in Britain, for example?
I mean, it used to be thought that the Greeks didn't have it, Hellenistic astrology. They had Kataki, which was electional, but that wasn't horary. But Dorian Greenbaum has shown that actually they were using horary, because some of the things on Kataki say, and this can be used to determine the best time to do something, or indeed you can use the hour that the question was made. So that's fairly clear cut that the Greeks were using it. It's very, very widely used in the early Arabic translations. People like Saul wrote a book on questions with exactly the same sort of questions that Lilly was asking, 900 years later, because Saul was writing in the 8th century. So it was used right up until the time of Lilly. Well, of course, it's still being used today. So yeah, it's got a very, very long history.
Was there a gap after Lilly?
It's hard to say, really. The astrology kind of went into decline to an extent, and there's this popular narrative that it kind of died out until the Theosophical Society and people like that came along. But I think Kim Farnell has fairly conclusively quashed that, and that there's a long almanac tradition, and that there were astrologers as well. It's a period that I'm a little bit hazy about, anything after the 18th century, but there is certainly a lot of research, and people like Kim Farnell are certainly very clued up on that particular area. So I don't know.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Wendy Fay is asking, how would Roger of Hereford have used the client's intention once determined?
It's a very, we don't, as I say, because we don't know very much about Roger of Hereford, we don't actually know if he had clients. He was teaching astrology to kids. Was he just a teacher, or was he a practicing astrologer as well? He was doing things other than teaching astrology. He was teaching them computus, which was in those days, fairly complicated arithmetic needed to synchronized sun and moon to be able to work out when Easter was. And he realized that traditional computers didn't really cut the mustard, and then invented his own new scheme that was much more accurate, that used partial days, because computers would sometimes, which is when calculating new moons and full moons, so you can work out the date of Easter, sometimes it would give a date that was 3 or 4 days out. And Roger realized that this was not very satisfactory and came up with a much better method. So he seems to be quite an innovator and was doing quite a lot of things, but we don't know whether he actually had clients or not. Presumably, given that the bishops and so on and priors were all very pro-astrology, he may well have been drawing up charts for them. But he certainly didn't seem to use them in any of the examples. The reason I got interested in this, my thesis, is somebody called Nick White, who did a MPhil on this particular text in 1992 for his thesis at Cambridge. And he's not an astrologer, he was a historian of science. And he now works as an economist in the European Union. So it's a completely different sort of, he's branched out into something completely different now. I've spoken to him a few times. But his particular thesis on that was looking at Roger and saying, aha, this worked example you've got, this must be the chart of somebody. And he concluded that it was the chart of Eleanor of Aquitaine. But there are so many flaws in it. And it was things like, well, obviously the chart doesn't quite work, but he probably meant Jupiter in Gemini rather than Jupiter in Cancer. Well, an astrologer wouldn't make that mistake, because we know that Jupiter in Cancer is exalted in medieval astrology and Jupiter in Gemini is in fall. And so I think Nick got that wrong, but then he was working from only one manuscript, whereas nowadays, thanks to digital photography, I was able to look at 23 manuscripts of Roger, not just 1 or 2. So we've got things available to us now that weren't around in 1992. So we can dig a lot deeper. And we've also got a lot of astrologers to thank for having produced really brilliant translations of various Arabic texts that, again, weren't available to Nick White when he was doing his MPhil. So I don't think that any of his chart examples are real. You've done it yourself when teaching astrology. You say, well, okay, imagine that there's Mars opposite Pluto and you've got a new moon in school, and you could draw up a chart. Even though we could draw up charts in seconds now, it took hours and hours and hours in those days. We draw up imaginary charts, and if somebody in the future said, well, hang on a minute, Graham was teaching astrology in the 21st century, and yet this chart, this configuration didn't occur. What on earth's going on? Whose chart was he looking at? And the answer is nobody's. It was just an example you made up on the top of your head, which we all do. And I think he was doing the same.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Well, it's 8:45 now, so I'd like to thank you very much, Chris, for sharing your erudition, your knowledge. It's been really interesting, and thank you for sharing the handout. I think, have you put that in the chat?
I did, yes. So just
Brilliant.
before my link to the thesis, I've put, as I say, it's not clickable. I'll put it in again because.
Oh yes, that's great.
So tinyurl.com/Roger Hereford.
Thank you.
That'll take you to my to the handout for this.
Okay, and I've had a look at the handout. It's really just as detailed, so it'd be really interesting to look at that and work through it. Thank you very much, Chris.